Today we're going to be learning Rosh Hashanah Daf Yud Gimel. Today's daf is sponsored by Debbie Gvir to commemorate the third year side of her dear father, Joseph Ginsburg, on the 17th of Cheshvan. Amongst his many unique qualities, my father had a love for language and a particular expertise in using it to enhance Torah reading and liturgical practice. I am sure he would be proud to know that my Aramaic is improving daily by learning the Daf Yomi with Rabbanit Michelle and my wonderful Chavrutot. Yehi Zichro Baruch. And by Sylvia Simmons in memory of her grandmother, Rachel Wall, Rachel Leah Bat Avraham Mordechai, on her yurtzeit today. And anonymously in memory of Rav Shach, Elazar Menachem Ben Man Ben Azulia. Okay, we're going to start our learning today with a bit of review of the very end of yesterday's daf. Okay, we've been talking about what the determining both what the date is for different things, and then we got to when the fruit, vegetable, when it gets to what stage, is that the stage that determines, right? Which stage determines when we count? As we know the dates for the Maaser, the dates for the Maaser, Aleph B'Tishrei, and for Shemitah. But at what stage does it need to be in? When do we count the date from what stage of the fruit? So we said, just to review, fruits from a tree goes by when they budded. So whatever year it was when they budded, whether it was after Rosh Hashanah, before Rosh Hashanah, that determines what year it's in for those purposes, right? Now, one of the relevant, again, what's the relevance for Maaser? Number one, which year in the Maaser cycle we are, whether you bring the poor man's tithe, right, that goes to the poor people, or do you bring Maaser Sheni to Jerusalem? And then we also learned, and this is important for today, that you can't mix new and old produce. I can't take produce from last year to take the truma from there on produce from next year, or the reverse. You can't mix them for the purposes of tithing your produce. So it's very important to know what's the cutoff, but it's not just what's the date that's the cutoff. It's also at what stage is the fruit supposed to be when you determine what year it is. So is it batar chanata for the trees? Tomorrow's daf, we're going to explain exactly why that is. That's the trees. When fruits of the tree, when it's vegetables, it goes by when you cut it from the ground, you detached it from the ground, likita it's called. That's for the vegetables. But then we saw yesterday that there's a different case, and today we'll see even another exceptional case, which is the ones that are obligated on a Torah level. Remember, we said that on a Torah level, the three mentioned in the Torah are dagan, tirosh, and yitzhal, which are grains. The tirosh is the grapes and the olives. So those three, we said, when they get to a third, that's what determines it. How do we know that? So we brought this verse at the end of yesterday's daf in the name of Rav Asi, in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, and they quoted it in the name of Rabbi Yossi Aglili, that it comes to this pasuk that talks about Hakel at the end of the 7-year cycle. You gather the people together, B'chag HaSukkot. Okay, but it says in the pasuk, Bishnat HaShmita. Now you're beyond Shnat HaShmita. So why are we calling it Shnat HaShmita if it's really the 8th year? So they say, that must teach you the kol tfuah shebi shlish b'shvi'it lifnei Rosh Hashanah tanoheg bo minhag shvi'it b'shminit. In other words, it's to tell you that there's certain produce that was considered last year's produce, even though it's really this year's produce. We're going to count it from last year. That's because if it already reached a third of its stage of ripening, or we said a third of its weight, there were different explanations, that's going to be considered last year's produce, even though it really grew this year, right? It ripened this year, let's say. So that's what we learned from that pasuk. Later on in today's daf, we're going to reject this, okay? We're going to reject some element of this, which we're going to get to right now, which is Amalei Rabbi Zera le Rav Asi. So Rabbi Zera says to Rav Asi, wait a minute. Dilma lo ayil klal. Maybe the verse, how do you know the verse is really referring to this shlish and all that? Maybe it's referring to something that never ripened at all. V'ka'ama rachmana tishamet v'tezel al chag HaSukkot. And maybe the pasuk is just telling you laws of Tosefet Shvi'it, right? We already learned you're supposed to add on to the Shemitah year. But maybe this has nothing to do with produce that was already reached a third. Maybe it's just telling you, right, the part of Shemitah, right? You can't work the land into the Shnat Shemitah and all that. To which he says, Lo Salkadat. I'm going to prove why it can't be that and why it must be that we learn from this verse about Shlish and that's what it means. Dichti. Again, as I told you, later on today's stuff, we're going to actually come back and reject this. But for right now, we think that this is this is where we're going, and we're going to explain how this pasuk gets to shlish. Dichtiv. It says in another pasuk, Chag Asif b'tzeit Hashanah. You have to read the whole, at least half the pasuk. Half the pasuk says, the second half, Chag Asif b'tzeit Hashanah. The Chag Asif is as the year leaves. Be'os bechad ma'asecha min hasadeh. When you gather your things from the field. Now, if you notice, there's repetition in this pasuk. It says Asif, and it says bas bechad. That's the same root. They both mean to gather. Okay. So my Asif. What does asif mean to gather? Gather could mean all sorts of things. At what stage? It could be at a later stage, right? We are talking about that we're going to see. Well, let's see exactly what we mean. Maybe it means a holiday where you gather things that are in the field, you bring them into your house. Okay, now that's going to mean not that you cut it from the ground, that you cut it earlier, but that you're bringing it into your house now. Now, if we did it that way, then it wouldn't prove anything about the shlish. Why? Because you could have cut it 15 days ago when it was still last year or 16 days ago. So if that's the case, it doesn't prove anything about shlish. It's just saying, yeah, there's some produce that you're now going to gather into your house. But since you cut it last year, it's last year's produce. And that teaches us absolutely nothing about what we're looking for. So he says, if you think that's what it means, haksi bas bechad already says when you gather. So since it says it twice in the pasuk, maybe one time means when you gather it into your house. But elamai asif, the first asif must be telling you katzil, that asif means to gather from what's attached to the ground, to cut it then. Okay, now let's think about it. How does that teach you shlish? Okay, the rabbis established that what? Kol tfuah shenichsera b'chag, biyadua shivya shlish lefnei Rosh Hashanah. Any grain that came in on Chag HaSukkot, it clearly must have been a third of its growth before Rosh Hashanah. It makes sense, right? We don't get from a third to a whole in 15 days. So therefore, and last line, v'kakare la b'tzeit Hashanah. It says, Chag Asif b'tzeit Hashanah, okay, which is trying to tell you that it's considered like last year. Okay, so even though you cut it now, since it was a third of its growth before, and you cut it now, and it's called B'tzeit Hashanah, it's referring back to last year's produce, meaning it's going to go by last year when it comes to the Maser because it was already a third. Okay, it's a little bit complicated and a little bit whatever, but that's their proof. Okay, like I said, soon we're going to reject it, but not so soon, because we're going to have a bit of a tangent. Okay, I'm kind of saying this because I want you to remember always this is right where we're up to, so that when we go back to it, you'll know where we ended. You'll remember that we were here. So again, what did we do? We brought a proof text from this b'moed shnat hashmita bit, right, b'chag HaSukkot, which is already the 8th year. We try to prove it from there. The problem is it doesn't really tell you shlish. So then they bring this other thing, b'chag HaSif, that teaches you that we're talking in the Chag HaSif that you cut it, not that you are just gathering it into your house, in which case we assume it must have been a third before, and that teaches you this issue of the third. And it says B'tzeit Hashanah, which means it's connected to last year. So now they say the following. Amar le Rabbi Yirmiyah le Rabbi Zera. You have to remember Rabbi Yirmiyah. He's the one who asks very annoying questions, okay? He's like that student in your class that every time you say something, you say, well, what if, and what if, and what if? And, sometimes it's interesting and nice, and sometimes it goes beyond, where it's okay to go, right? Some people like that. Right? Sometimes his questions are very good and in place, and sometimes he gets the rabbis upset by what he says. This time he went a little too far. So Rabbi Yirmiyah says to Rabbi Zera, "V'kimhu l'Rabbanan ben shlish lepachot mishlish." He says, do the rabbis really understand? It's like saying, right? The rabbis are in the Beit Midrash. Do they really understand what's going on in agriculture? And even if they are, let's say, in agriculture, did they really understand exactly this distinction between a third, less than a third, at a third, right? It's what he's basically asking is, how do you know it's a third, right? And it's very nice. You taught this halacha. It's a third. Okay, but I want to know practically, right? This is the classic student who just doesn't understand to the end. Like, but what do I do? How do I know? How do I know it's a third? Now, instead of saying that, he said, how do the rabbis know to distinguish between exactly a third and under a third, over a third? Seems very impossible for them to figure out, right? It's hard to know. First of all, you don't know how big your fruit's actually going to become, or your vegetable, or whatever it is. So how do you know when it's a third of its growth or not? It's very complicated. So this is a very weird right? If you say, I'm going to see later in the daf, there's hashrasha, or we talked about chanata or likita. Those are very clearly defined points, right? You could say, oh, I saw the bud come out, that budded. I saw the roots come out. I saw the seeds come out. You can see something. I cut it. Okay, it was an action. But to say a third, it's very complicated. How do you know when it's a third? To which Rabbi Zera doesn't like this question. Amarle, lava minalach, lo tepug nachshach levar mehilchata. Exactly how I define this is a good question, but don't take yourself out of halacha. In other words, why are you starting to question things? Okay, don't question things all the time, especially that's why I wanted you to know where Rabbi Yirmiyah is. But you can see this isn't just a one-off question. This is part of a slew of questions he always asks that kind of annoyed the teacher. And says, why are you starting to, mock the rabbis almost and say, what, they don't know anything? You can't say that. Kol midot chachamim kenhu. Any measurement, this is part of a bigger slew of every time they have a measurement. So you could say this about anything. And the fact is, yes, they drew lines. This is the line they drew before shlish, after shlish. And yes, they must know how to make that distinction. Here he goes with a list of shiurim. Ba'arba'im se'ah tovel, when the mikvah is 40 se'ah, you can dip in it. That's the minimum amount. Ba'arba'im se'ah chaser kortuv eno yochel litbol ben. We don't know what a kortuv is. It's a very small measurement. Point is, right, you'll see the next ones you'll be more familiar with. The point is, if you take a little teeny bit out of that 40 se'ah and you're missing a little bit under 40 se'ah, that's not going to be a good mikvah. Yes, we make these very, right? It's classic. You make there's a deadline, can I bring it a day late? No, this is the deadline, right? This is where it is. This is where the line cutoff is. Okay, this will be more, you'll get a sense of how small we're talking about. If the food is the size of an egg, then it's mitame tumat ochlin. Okay, this we've had there's a big machloket about this. Does this mean it has the power? The simple reading is mitame tumat ochlin. It can pass on impurity to other foods. Some of the commentaries think that kibetza is the shiur also for becoming tameh. For food, a food can only become tameh if it's actually a kibetza. Not everyone agrees with that. Every time we bring this up, we bring up that machloket. It's either that it can pass on impurity or both, really. It can both pass on impurity and also become impure. So there's a debate about which one it means. Does it mean both or only one? And if it's one, it's then mitame. It passes on impurity, but it could be much smaller to become impure itself. So now they say, but if you have a kibetza, the size of an egg minus a sesame seed, okay, sesame seed is teeny. That's why I wanted you to write a kortuv. You could say, I see you're writing in the chat, right? It means a pinch or something, right? But here you get a real amount of sesame seed, teeny. A little bit less than that already won't. Okay, next. 3 by 3 tefachim handbreadths can be mitame tumat midras. I'm not going to go into again what tumat midras is. We'll get to when we're really dealing with midras, but it's about, a cloth that you can use for sitting on or something like that. But if it's missing one strand, again, you can see how teeny we're talking about, it's already not going to be mitame tumat midras. Now I see you're writing, Erica, that there is a difference. Okay, if I read correctly, I'll look more clearly, but there's a difference between these are absolute measurements and a third is really not an absolute measurement. And it's true. What you're saying is that Rabbi Yirmiyah really does have a good question. Even if you take all of those seriously, you still have this issue that a third is not a clear measurement. So Rabbi Yirmiyah really had a good question. But as every good student does, Rabbi Yirmiyah is put in his place, and his response is, okay, again, there's different ways, and I wouldn't say every good student, but it's right. If your teacher puts you in your place, and you're a good kid, you accept it and you admit I made a mistake, and you move on. He's gonna kind of, I would say this is like someone who brings an apple to the teacher, right? He wants to kind of flatter, kind of go up to the teacher like this. So what does he do? Hadaram Rabbi Yirmiyah, lav milti damri. You're right. What I said really doesn't hold any weight. And in fact, he goes farther to say, I'm going to now show you, I came up with an example where I can show you that you're right. The rabbis really did know to distinguish between a third and a third. Unfortunately, his proof is not going to really hold up, but he's going to try. And this is how we've gotten on a total tangent. Okay. And that's why we're going to eventually go back reminding you to the proof about how we got to the shlish is the amount, because it's this Chag Asif and it's the katsir, and it must have been a shlish before, right? We'll get back to that. So now he says, so if the friends of Rav Kahana asked him, the first year they got into the land, we're going to see they got into the land on the 10th of Nisan. And then we're going to see that they brought the Korban HaOmer on the 16th. We're not going to see it explicitly, but it's going to be alluded to in the text. Now, they bring the Korban HaOmer from the barley crop. And we're going to see the barley crop has to come from a Jewish crop and not from a Gentile crop. So how exactly did that work? Okay, Shuli Mishkin in Flashback this week on our site, on Hadron's site, has a whole thing about the history about when they got into the land that first year. So if you want to read more about it, you can read there. So here goes his question. How did they bring a Korban HaOmer that year, he says. They asked Rav Kahana, Im tomar da'al biyad nochri, if it was that it became ripe in the hands of the Gentiles, well, mimai da'klivu. I'm sorry, k'tzirchem amar Rachman, avalo k'tzir nochri. It says you have to bring merishit k'tzirchem, okay, from the, not reshit there. Yeah, reshit k'tzirchem ala kohen. You're supposed to bring the omer, reshit k'tzirchem, the first of your cutting. So it can't be that they took stuff that the Gentiles had cut, okay? You have to cut it yourself. However, okay, so now they ask a flip question. Wait, you're asking a question. How did they do the Omer that year? How do you know they did the Korban HaOmer? Maybe they didn't. You can imagine. Hard to imagine. They got into the land, immediately did the Korban HaOmer. Well, they did. How do we know? Right? They say, Dilma lo akrivu. Maybe they didn't. Well, lo sakadata. Unlikely. Why? It says explicitly in Sefer Yoshua that they ate from the crop of the land Mimochorat Pesach. What's Mochorat Pesach? The day after the first day of Pesach, the day we bring the Korban HaOmer, which permits the eating of all the new grain. So it seems pretty clear that this pasuk is referencing the fact that they brought the Korban HaOmer and therefore they ate from the new crop after they brought the Omer. So they brought the Omer, but the Omer was all, right? How'd they get it? Not from Gentile produce. So now we're going to have to figure out. They certainly didn't have their own produce. So now they say, right? So first of all, how do we learn from this pasuk Mimochorat Pesach? Because it says Mimochorat Pesach achil. It's telling you specifically they ate from the day after Pesach. Meikara lo achil. But it seems to indicate that from before, right, from yesterday or from before that date, they didn't eat. So that seems to be because they did the Korban HaOmer. Taklivu Omer bahadar achle. Must be they brought the Omer and that permitted them to eat. Otherwise, there would be no point to say it was Mimochorat Pesach. So now they say, so now we're back to square one. So where did they get barley crop to bring the Omer with? Amar lahu, kol shelo evi shli. Amar lahen. So Rav Kahana answered them, because remember, this was the Chevraya asked Rav Kahana. He answers them and says, kol shelo evi shlish biyad nochli. It must be that it didn't ripen to a third of where it was supposed to be in the hands of the nochri. They took over. They found some crop that wasn't a third ripened. They took it over and said, this is ours. We're going to cut the barley from here. And then it became a third while it was in the possession of the Jews. And then they sacrificed it. Now, what does this have to do with our point? He says, Dilma ayah below kimlahu. In order to bring it, it had to be for sure theirs. Now, maybe it was a shlish already and they didn't realize, right? In other words, again, were they experts in this area? So the fact that they brought the korban from this omer, even though theoretically you could say maybe they weren't able to distinguish between a third and not a third, so they say it must be elakim lahu. It must be they really knew how to distinguish this third. I can almost imagine the scene, right? We're thinking also a third. How would you know it's a third, right? So maybe they're coming and saying doesn't make sense, but they're basically saying maybe we don't understand. They must, right? They must know more than we do. Okay, they must know how to determine the third, because if they didn't, how could they possibly bring the Omer? They're assuming right now, and this is going to explain the continuation, they're assuming it must have been close to a third. And they then took it over and it became a third ripened. And then it became, you have to remember, to cut it has to be fully ripened. So we need a timeline here to understand how this works. So in a second, we're going to get the chronology. The assumption is that they must have taken it over not very long before, because they only entered the land we're going to see on the 10th of Nisan. So they didn't have a lot of time. So therefore, they're assuming if it had to be less than a third grown, so it must have been close to a third. Otherwise, when would it ripen fully by the time of the 16th. So they say, right, it must be they really had the ability to distinguish between a third, before a third, and after a third. Hachanami kimlu. So therefore, we could say the same thing about the rabbis. And that's Rabbi Uriah's proof. He says, you told me this. I'm going to prove to you that you're right. And, almost like buttering up to the teacher. Now the Gemara says, wait, not really, because Dilma lo ayil klal. Maybe it wasn't ripe at all before they got it, right? When they took it over. And then it's not like you can easily distinguish between not ripe at all and a third, right? That would be easy, right? I could tell if something's not really grown at all. Obviously, it hasn't gotten to a third. But if it's already a quarter of the way, right, between a quarter and a third, but that doesn't necessarily prove that they can distinguish between once it passes the quarter and it's close to a shlish before it gets to a third, right? The difference between a quarter and a third is not so big. And maybe they couldn't distinguish, right? I'm thinking of my measuring cups in my house, right? When you look in the drawer and you don't see what it says, and can you distinguish between which one's the quarter, which one's the third, right? Probably can at this point. But if it was bigger than a quarter and a little less than, right, it would be hard. It would be hard to, when you see them there and you don't see what the writing is on it, right? It's confusing. I mean, I always double check because I'm always worried that maybe I don't really know. So it's like that. So now they say, lo salkadata. No, it's also unlikely that that was the case, that it wasn't really ripe at all. How could that possibly be? Dichtiv. And here we get to the chronology. They got out of the Jordan River, crossing over into the land, be'esor lachodesh, on the 10th of the month. Again, as I told you, Shula's going to she takes this from more of a historical, the Psukim showing the chronology a little better than the Gemara does, although it's pretty good here. So the 10th, they get into the land, and they're supposed to find, the assumption is here, they found unripe produce, and then 6 days later, miraculously, it was ready. Seems weird. So then they say, right, if you think it wasn't ripe at all, in 5 days it's going to ripen? No way. Elamai. So then what? So then they're going to say, it must be da'ayil riva odanka. If you're going to say that it was somewhat ripe, right? So it was maybe a quarter or a sixth. Akate b'chamisha yoma mikamalia. In other words, if you're going to say it was close to a third, so let's say it was a quarter or it was a sixth. Well, if that's the case, still, how could it possibly ripen? So then they say, elamai lachlamema eretz tzvi ktivba hachanami eretz tzvi ktivba. The land of Israel is called Eretz Tzvi. Eretz Tzvi, what's a tzvi known for? A deer runs very fast. So therefore, the land is the land of the tzvi. That means that things ripen super fast. So now they're going to say, either which way, it had to be at least a sixth ripen or a quarter. So once you say that, right, you could say whatever it was, right? In other words, you can in the end say it doesn't matter. In other words, the point is it can't prove to you that it was just under a third, because you could say it was a sixth, you could say it was an eighth, and it still would have ripened in time because it was somewhat miraculous how it ripened, because the land is a land that ripens fruit very quickly. And therefore, again, this doesn't really prove anything about that the rabbis knew how to distinguish between a third and less than a third. And again, they're using not rabbis here, they're using the people who entered the land. But the point is, if the people who entered the land could have figured it out, then the rabbis could figure it out. But in the end, we can't really prove it because we really don't know how ripe it was when they took over. And therefore, even though it was so close chronologically, somehow miraculously this could have happened. Now we're going to, I like the connection, Emma, about the fast pregnancies, right? About those who mate earlier or not. Okay, now we're going to go back, as I promised you, to the proof. Chag HaAsif, we said was Asif is Katzil. And from there we get, if you're cutting it now, it must have been, it already had Shlish when Rosh Hashanah came. Otherwise, you wouldn't be cutting now. Again, maybe with this Eretz Tzvi, you would have to say otherwise, but no, we're not going to assume the Eretz Tzvi holds for all generations. Okay, so therefore, we're back to the Shlish and this proof. I'm going to have a question on that. Matkifla Rabbi Chanina. Rabbi Chanina says, no, that proof doesn't really work. Why? Why are you assuming Asif means Katzil? The Haktiv, doesn't it say, okay, this is a verse that says, Chag HaSukkot, you should do Shivat Yamim when you collect. And it says the Goren and the Yekev. Now, the Goren and the Yekev is not, right, you would think if it's when you cut it in the fields, that it would be talking about the fields. The Goren and the Yekev is where they're already collected once you've already processed the wheat and the olives and the grapes. So Amar Mar, someone already said about that pasuk. Psolet goren v'yekev. They're talking about the psolet, with the stuff, the chaff. Now, when do you get the chaff? At a much later stage. So it sounds like Chag Asif is not referring to the katsir. That happens a few stages before we get to the point where we have the psolet and we're in the goren and the yekev. So it doesn't make sense that it's talking about katsir, which means that your proof that it was already a third because you're cutting it now is not really a good proof. So therefore, Amar Rabbi Zera, Ha milta havi biyadan, ba'ata Rabbi Chanina shade beinarga. It's actually interesting. First, we have Rabbi Yirmiyah, who realized he was knocked out, right? And okay, let's get the characters here. We started our daf with, first we had Rabbi Asi in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, who brought this verse about Shnat HaShemitah in the 8th year. Then Rabbi Zera came and gave an explanation for how we get to Shlish from there, from Chag Asif. And he said, Chag Asif must be Katsir. Then Rabbi Yirmiyah asked a question on him. And then Rabbi Yirmiyah kind of explains, right? Rabbi Yirmiyah admits defeat to Rabbi Zera, because he asked the question to Rabbi Zera. Rabbi Zera gets upset with him for his question and he admits defeat. Now we have Rabbi Zera admitting defeat. So there's a little bit of irony here, right? That Rabbi Zera now admits defeat and he also says it in a kind of, right? Rabbi Yirmiyah got up there and said, what I said doesn't really hold any water. Rabbi Zera says in a bit of a different way, he says, this thing we had in our hands, we understood it, or we thought we understood it. But now came Rabbi Chanina and he shot an arrow into it, right? He basically knocked down our shita entirely. And again, it's a way of admitting defeat and saying, wow, maybe he learned it from a student. Rabbi Yirmiyah was willing to admit defeat. He's now willing to admit defeat. So now what happens? Elaminalam. He comes and says, okay, so now the Gemara says, we don't know who's saying this, but the Gemara says, so in fact, where do we get it from then? This idea of shlish. And for that, they bring a totally different pasuk, Kiditanya, as it says in the following bright. Right, you would have thought they would have brought this before if it was a Breita. It existed before, but probably they didn't know about it. Remember, Breita were passed down by word of mouth, orally. So maybe someone then brings into the Beit Midrash the following Breita. Rabbi Yonatan ben Yosef Omer. Before we read the pasuk, I'm going to explain to you the background. When it comes to, we've been talking about Shemitah and Yovel. We had a lot of discussion about that. So again, we're sitting in year number 6. We're about to go into the Shemitah year, let's say. Okay, or let's say right now we're in the Shemitah year. Let's assume next year was Yovel. Next year was Yovel. What would happen? We don't work the land this year. We don't work the land next year. So when I'm at the end of the 6th year, okay, if you're a worrier, what are you going to start doing? Worry, okay, well, next year, maybe I'll have a few things still left from this year, okay, in the 7th year. By the 8th year, I haven't worked the land for a year. I'm not going to have anything. And by the 9th year, I'm really messed up, right? Even if something randomly grows, I'll have something. But by the 9th year, I haven't worked the land for 2 years. I'm not going to have anything to eat. So what does the Torah tell us? You're going to be blessed. If you keep your Shemitahs and you keep your Yovels, God will bring you a blessing that things will grow anyway. Okay. Va'asita, the pasuk says, we're in Vayikra, chapter 25, pasuk 21. Va'asita et hatfu'a l'shalosh hashanim. Okay, it says, I'll even read the beginning. V'tziviti et birchati lachem b'shana hashishit. I will command a blessing to you. That asita tatfu'a l'shalosh hashanim, you're going to make the grains for 3 years. In other words, 3 years are the 7th, the 8th, and the 9th year. Here comes the drasha. You ready? Al tikre l'shalosh, ela l'shlish. Don't read this as 3. Read this as a third, which means what? What are we talking about? Again, this is drasha world, out of context a little bit, but we're talking about the 6th year, and we're saying a third is important. What they're saying is that next year, whatever you eat, if it came from the 6th year and it was a third grown in the 6th year, asita l'shalosh hashanim means asita l'shlish. If already it was a shlish, you'll be able to eat it the next year. It won't have the sanctity of shvit. It'll still be considered 6th year produce. Okay, again, it's clearly not what the pasuk's telling you, but it's a drasha. That's the world of drasha. You're allowed to do this kind of thing. So now the Gemara questions, when are you allowed to do drashot? Okay, if we're in the world of drashot, there's rules. You can't just say anything you want, anytime you want. You need it to be a verse that wasn't necessary for the simple reading, and then it gives you an option to darshan it because it's extra, let's say. But Jaime Baile Legufe, but you need this verse to tell you, if people ask, what are we going to eat in the 3rd year? Tell them, don't worry, this is what you're going to eat. You'll have a blessing. So the Gemara says, you really don't need this pasuk. Why? Because there's a different verse. That verse says, okay, there's a different pasuk, which is, וזרעתם את השנה השמינית, ואכלתם מן התבואה ישן עד השנה התשיעית. You should plant in the 8th year, and you will eat the grains, yashan, ad hasha'at she'it. And you're going to be eating the old grains from before Shemitah until the 9th year. So you already said the pshat reading of that pasuk in a different verse. So you don't need both verses, in which case that verse is open to darshan shlish, and from there we get shlish. That's really the source, not from the asif, because that really wasn't a good enough proof. Even there, by the way, if we took the asif pasuk, it never really said a third. So therefore, we're now going to say, this teaches you a shlish. I'm not sure what the question is. This assumes no yovel. Can you explain what you mean? This is yovel. This is when there's a yovel year, and the 8th year, right? In other words, the 8th year is the yovel year. You won't be able to work the land. And the 9th year, you want to produce. And here it comes to tell you, you will have produce in the 9th year. Okay. So I'm not sure what the question is. If you want to write it, you can write it. I'll try to look at it. And I see this a longer message in the chat, which I can't read while I'm teaching. So I'll get back to it at the end of class. Okay, next Mishnah, Tnan Hatam. Now we're going to quote, we're not at the next Mishnah, but, I see. I see your question. Uzratem et hashana shminit v'achaltem min hatvua yashan ad hashana atchiit. I see. This verse seems to indicate that you're actually planting in the 8th year. That's a good question. I didn't look that up. I have to look it up about what the simple reading of that verse is. Why it seems to be talking about planting in the 8th year. But maybe that pasuk is talking, I think that pasuk is talking about a year where there's no yovel, maybe. I have to look inside, but maybe it's talking about no yovel. In the 8th year, you'll plant and you'll eat. Until then, you'll eat from before. And then the other pasuk was talking about when there's yovel. But either which way, the idea is clear that you'll have a blessing that will take you for whatever you need. It's a good question. I have to look inside. Okay, Tanan Hatam. Now we're quoting a different Mishnah. And as I mentioned in the beginning of class, we have, again, let's just review. Ilan batar chanata. It goes after budding. We're going to read this all inside very soon. Vegetables go by when you cut them. The tvu'ah, right, those three things, dagan, tirosh, and yitzhal, the grains, the olives, and the grapes, all go by shlish, a third of the growth. And now we're going to learn that there's an exception to this rule. Okay, Tanan Hatam. There's 1/4 category. Ha'orez, v'hadochan, v'pragim, v'ashumshimim. These are all what we call kitniot. Okay, they're things, they're not, right, they're a little bit different than vegetables. We'll see why in a minute. Rice and millet and poppies and sesame. Sheishrishu lifnei Rosh Hashanah. The determining date for them, according to this Mishnah, this is a Mishnah in Shvi'it, not Shemitah, about Shemitah. The determining date for them is when they took root, which is very weird because we didn't see that anywhere, right? Nobody said when it takes root. So mitasrim l'sha'avar, okay? If they took root, which is a very early stage, before Rosh Hashanah, then their maaser goes by the previous year. Mutarim b'shvi'it, and then they'll be permitted in the Shemitah year. If, let's say, it was the 6th year, then they're not Shemitah produce because they go by the previous year. Ve'im lav, if not, if it didn't take root before Rosh Hashanah, then obviously it'll be considered this year's produce. Asurim b'shvi'it, right? If it's Shemitah year, they'll be forbidden. And if it's not Shemitah year, right? Mitaslim l'shana haba, if it's not the Shemitah year, it'll go by whatever maaser year it is right now. Amar Rabba. So Rabba hears this Mishnah and he says something's not right with this Mishnah. Amor Rabbanit. The rabbi said, Ilam batar chanata, tfuah zeitim batar shlish, right? This is what we just said. Fruit of the tree goes by budding. The tfuah, the grains and the zaitim and the olives, even though they skip the grapes, they mean the grapes also, go by shlish, a third. Yerek or yarak batar lekita. Vegetables go by reaping. Hane keman shavinu Rabbanan. What are these? In other words, there's no category like this of hishrishu. Where does this come from? So Hadarama Rabba thought about it and he said it must be the following. Mitoch asviyim prachim. This is something very interesting. Again, there's different explanations what prachim is. We'll go by Rashi. Rashi says, if you look in Rashi, shasuyim prachim, it's right next to there in Rashi, a little bit higher than our line. Mitoch shegranan asui ma'at ma'at, she'ein milkatim ke'echad, ela hayom loktin u'mafachim ma'at, u'lemachar ma'at. This is the kind of thing that ripens a little bit at a time, which means that people bring it into their house a little bit at a time. Therefore, there's going to be a big problem. If we go after the kita, which it should be, something that grows from the ground, it's like vegetables. then what's going to happen? I'm going to end up very likely getting into a situation where I have a mixture of things that I did before, that I brought in before Rosh Hashanah, and things that I brought in after Rosh Hashanah. And that's going to create a problem because remember, you can't take from one on the other. So we're going to say like this. The rabbis instituted then that we're going to go by Hashrasha. The rabbi said, now remember, this is only obligated in tithes by rabbinic law. So the rabbis are going to come and say, we can determine that this is not going to go by the way it normally goes. We're going to change this. We're going to say it goes by Hashrasha because why? No one collects it at the point of Hashrasha. It hasn't grown yet. If we do the cutoff date by Hashrasha, you'll never have a situation where you have a mixture, and that will resolve the issue. So that's what Rabbah says. That must be why these are exceptions to the rule. It was a rabbinic takana, we call it, right? In order and ordinance to say, we want to save the people from making a mistake and mixing the two together and taking truma from one on the other or masik. And therefore, we made a different cutoff date that will never create this problem. Well, this opens up a bit of a question. Amar Abaye, which is going to lead us to kind of through to the end of the daf. V'itzbor grano letocho v'nimtza tohem min hachadash shabo al hachadash shabo min yashan shabo al yashan shabo. Abaye says, why don't you just put, let's say you have this problem that you gathered some today and it was Erev Rosh Hashanah, and you gathered some the next week and it was past Rosh Hashanah, and you put them all together and now you don't know what's what and how you're going to do Truma Namaskar. There's a better solution, and this is otherwise known as what we call bila. Okay, bila is from kind of mixing things together, like balul comes up in the Torah, balul b'shemen, it's mixed up with shemen, the mincha offering. Bila means that we can take last year's crop and this year's crop, and what can we do? We can combine them all together and then take a big scoop of the kitniot, okay, a big scoop of rice. Assume that if we mixed it up really well, when I take out my maslo, let's say 70% was last year and 30% is this year, we can assume that when I take out my scoop, likely it's about 70% of this year and whatever, I don't remember, 70% of last year, 30% of this year. It's probably about the same percentage. We can assume. It's a little bit like Brera, but not exactly, because Brera is retroactive designation. We're not trying to designate anything retroactively. We know it was this and this was that, and we can't start saying, oh, well, assume that was that. You can't do that, but you can say, I'm basically going to scoop up this and assume the percentages are about the same and this should work. So whatever I've taken my maser now, I have new and I have old. So I'm not taking from the new on the old and the old on the new. I'm not taking one that's kind of for last year, let's say, and it's this year's produce. No, I'm taking a bit from both, basically. So the one that whatever I have in my hand, that goes on that. Whatever I have there goes on it. It should all work. And not only is he suggesting this, but Milo Tanya doesn't say in a Braita that you can do this. If you have this type of bean, this Egyptian bean that you planted in order for the seeds, either you want to eat the seeds or you want to replant the seeds. If some of it took root before Rosh Hashanah and some of it took root after Rosh Hashanah, this should sound familiar. You can't take masrot from one on the other. You can't take from the new on the old on the new. We know this already. But comes Rabbi Shimon Shizuri and says, but how do you do it? So you do exactly this thing called bila, which is you mix it all up together very well. And then you assume that I've got partly chadash in my hand, partly yashan. The yashan part will go on the yashan, the chadash part will go on the chadash, and we're all good. So Amarle, he says to him, why didn't I suggest doing this? In other words, again, instead of the rabbi starting to say, let's say it goes by Hashrasha, they could have just said, if you're going to have this problem, mix it all together well, take Truma Masra, it won't be a problem. So Amarle, Rabbi Shimon Shizuri, Kamarta, Rabbi Shimon Shizuri, Savar Yesh Bila. The Rabbanan Savar Ein Bila. In other words, he says to Abaye, Rabbi says, you're trying to quote me Rabbi Shimon Shizuri, but the rabbis disagree with him. We don't hold that way. To which Amar Rabbi Yitzchak. Yitzchak comes in. I don't know if he's necessarily responding to this, but he comes in and gives us a psak halachav Shmuel about this topic. He says, Amar Rabbi Yitzchak bar Nachmani Amar Shmuel halachak Rabbi Yossi ben Kippar shamar mishum Rabbi Shimon Shizuri. He says we actually paskin this way, which sounds like there's bila. What's the problem? Mat kifla Rabbi Zera umi Amar Shmuel hachi v'har Amar Shmuel lakol ein bila chutz miyayin v'shemen. He says, what are you talking about? Shmuel says that. Shmuel says elsewhere, there is no such thing as bila. only when it comes to liquids, because liquids, right, you can understand now. You have kitniot, a pile of rice, so there's individual particles. They don't all mix together perfectly. But when it comes to wine and oil, everything is kind of like one unit. So we can distinguish between liquids and solids, but solids doesn't work. So how could he have held like Rabbi Shimon Shazuri in our Mishnah, in the Breita there, that said that you can, right? There's bila, you can mix it together, but yet he holds that you can't. So the response is, and I'm going to leave you in a bit of suspense because the response really doesn't answer all the questions, but the response is, you forgot what Shmuel said. You forgot that Shmuel says, we don't go by hashrasha, we go by when the pre is ripened. It's like the opposite extreme, right? We go by when the pre ripens. That's the determining date, not hashrasha. How does this resolve the question? We don't really understand yet. Gemara tomorrow, which hopefully will be up in the next hour or so, you should be able, if you're really in suspense, you can already listen, which is, how do these three statements of Shmuel make sense together? It's going to start with the tzricha. We need all these three statements because without any one of them, we wouldn't have the full picture of what Shmuel holds. And in the end, we're going to work these three statements of Shmuel together. Number one, there's no bila other than wine, other than liquids. Number two, we hold like Rabbi Shimon Shazuri, who said that the pula mitzri, if it took root before Rosh Hashanah, and if you have ones that took root after Rosh Hashanah, you can't take from one and the other, but you can mix them all together and take from them, which sounds like yesh bila, which seems to totally contradict. And then this third statement, which somehow resolves everything, which I don't really understand yet how, is, oh, well, everything goes by Gemar Pri, by when the Pri is actually ripened. And that's going to explain to us why he, yes, holds like Rabbi Shimon Shazuri, and also holds yesh bila, ain bila, and we'll have to explain that in tomorrow's shiur. Have a great Shabbat, everyone. If you want, I could do a quick sum up of the daf, of what we did, to just give you a little bit of perspective. So we started with the Mishnah about the different dates. And with that, we took out the Tfu'ah, right? And the Zaytim, and we also on Avim, and we said that Shlish. Where do we get it from? We bought this Pasuk about Chag Asif is really Katzil, and then it must have been a third. Then Rabbi Yirmiyah came in with this question and said, what are you talking about? How did the rabbis possibly distinguish between a third and a third? Rabbi Zera came and said, how could you possibly suggest that not? And then Rabbi Yirmiyah admits defeat and kind of says, okay, well, I'll explain my theory of how this could be, but he really doesn't succeed, bringing in the Omer. Then we had Rabbi Zera himself, who gets rejected by Rabbi Chanina, and he admits defeat. And then we have a Breita that actually brings the real source, which comes from the Yovel in the third year. And really, it doesn't mean the third year, it means Shlish, according to the Drasha. Then we switched over to a fourth category. We had the three categories of trees, vegetables, and the ones that are obligated on the Torah law, the grain and the olives and the grapes in the third category. Now we bring a fourth category of kitniot, which ripen over which slowly ripen over time. Because of that, the rabbis instituted, we're going to go by hashrasha. Then, right, which, by the way, at the end of our daf, we see that Shmuel disagrees with that whole theory. He says we don't go by hashrasha, we go by Gemar Pri. Okay, that's remember that kind of connects with that. And then Abayis, right? So the whole question was, why is that? Rabbi explained it's because it ripens over time. Came Abai and he said, but that shouldn't bother us because you could just mix everything together because yesh bila. As Rabbi Shimon Shazuri says, they answered, no, the rabbis don't hold by bila. And then we took this issue of, wait a minute, Shmuel does hold by Rabbi Shimon Shazuri, even though the rabbis disagree and they tried to say we don't hold that way. But it also doesn't really seem to work with other things Shmuel said. And then we bring in the third statement. And tomorrow we're going to see how the three statements of Shmuel work in together. Quick summary of the daf. Okay. Have a great Shabbat, everyone. We will meet up on Sunday.